Okay, Herb Wagener, can you tell us a little bit about your early family and where they came from?
Well, my father's grandparents migrated here from Germany in about 1860. The lost my train of thought.
That's okay. We'll cut that out.
Okay.
Okay, let's start again. So, Herb Wagener, could you tell us a little bit about your family, how they got here, a little bit about the history?
My father's grandparents migrated here from Germany about 1860. His parents' names were Christian and Emma Wagener. They settled in Wheeling, West Virginia. Her maiden name was Dittman. That was the Americanized version. It was Detmon when they came here. I might add a little story about something I possess here that came with him on that voyage. It's a coffee maker that my great-grandparents brought with them. So that was 150 years ago. We don't know when it was made, so we know it's quite old, and I'm happy to have it. My great-great-grandmother died on that voyage and was buried at sea. They had no way to preserve a body in those days, and they had no choice but to dispose of the body at sea. As I say, my grandparents on my dad's side settled in Wheeling. My grandfather worked at Marsh Wheeling all his career, made cigars by hand, stogies they call them. My dad was born 1896 in Wheeling and grew up there. He enlisted in the Army in 1917, I guess, World War I. My mother's family, Dennis and Elizabeth Grigsby, were her parents. All the time I was growing up, they lived on a farm and were farmers up in the Panhandle of West Virginia near Fallensby. The story as I've heard it, my mother got a job in Wheeling and rented a room for my grandparents, and that's how my parents met each other. After my dad returned from military service, they married in Wheeling. I have one sister who was born in Wheeling in 1919, Betty Calvert. She now lives about a block from where I'm living right now. She's 91 years old. In 1919, my father obtained a job at the Waynesburg, I forget the exact, plate and tin mill, I think it was, up in West Waynesburg. So they moved to Waynesburg, and I was born here in 1927, June the 23rd. I went to school in the elementary school and graduated from high school in 1944. I started school in East Ward School, located just a few blocks from where I was born on Braden Street. I went there 5 years. I skipped the second grade, and during that time, when I was in the third grade, my mother died, 1935. I went on and finished in that school, went to 7th and 8th grade at the South Ward School building, and then went to what is now Margaret Bell Miller School a middle school, but at that time it was a high school. And as I said, I graduated in 1944. After I graduated, I got a job that summer, what we called then a defense job. It was at Patterson Field in Ohio, and it was a facility where they repaired aircraft engines. My job was to sandblast the carbon off of the aircraft cylinders. A job I didn't like very well, but it was a job. I enrolled in Penn State University, started the fall term there, quit the job out there, and went to Penn State. Went there one semester and learned of a program that the Army had called the Army Specialized Training Reserve Program. So in December of 1944 I enlisted and was assigned to Penn State in this program. They furnished housing, food, uniforms, but no pay. But actually that didn't matter because they gave you everything you needed. So I went to school there then under that program until I became, by the way, I was only 17 when I enlisted. So I stayed in that program until I was 18 in June of 1945. At that time I had to then go to basic training. I first went to Camp Atterbury for assignment, and from there went to Shepherd Field at Wichita Falls, Texas. I was there about a month, and they decided to take my group and move them to Keesler Field in Mississippi, near Biloxi. We started our basic training over again. So my basic training was longer than most. Finished basic training in the early part of 1946. I was selected to go to cryptographic school at Scott Field, Illinois. I felt honored to be selected for that program. You had to, in the Army General Classification Test, you had to have 110 to go to officer school. To go to cryptographic school, you had to have 120. So
IQ?
Kind of yeah. So I graduated from that school and was sent to Greensboro, North Carolina, which was called a replacement depot. You go there to wait for assignment to a permanent base. The time frame here is a little bit loose because a lot of times when you were transferred from one place to another, they would give you what was called a delay en route. In other words, a furlough. So at any rate, I reported to Greensboro and was there for some period of time and received an assignment to Tachikawa Air Force Base in Japan. So we traveled across the country from North Carolina to Seattle on a troop train, 5 days and 5 nights. Not a bad trip, actually. It was first time I'd been to the West Coast, and I pretty much enjoyed it. So we reported to Fort Lawton, Washington, and then were assigned to a ship. I went to Japan on the Marine Serpent. Took 12 days from Seattle to Yokohama. We went by train to Tachikawa Air Force Base. I was trained as a cryptographer, but when I got there, they didn't need anybody in that classification, so I was assigned to an office called the Statistical Control Office. That was the 317th Troop Carrier Group of the 5th Army Air Forces, and they operated a military airline between Japan, Korea, and China, and we kept the records on the aircraft. While I was there, I was promoted to corporal. In April 1947, I was sent back to the United States. That was an 18-day trip on the Wisteria.
Before you left Japan, though, what were some of the things that happened to you over there that may have impacted on you? I mean, as far as the way the place looked, the culture. Can you just relate one of those stories, maybe?
Well, I really enjoyed my time in Japan. Their way of life, their culture is so different from ours. I was surprised that I didn't encounter any animosity from the Japanese people that I got acquainted with. From what I heard, they didn't want that war. It was put on their backs by the higher-ups like Tojo and Hirohito and the military leaders. They seemed to be so relieved that it was over. Now, the war had only been over about a year when I arrived there, and they had barely started to rebuild. Things were pretty much bombed out, burned out. I remember seeing a B-29 that had crash landed on a riverbank, and it was still laying there. Nobody had ever done anything about it. It was, and that would have been, like say, at least a year later. While I was in Japan, I had the opportunity to climb Mount Fuji, which was quite an experience. We drove down there, there were about 8 of us, I guess. We drove up the mountain as far as we could, and then we walked for 14 hours at night, mostly at night, because of we had to get back at a certain time, so we had no choice but to keep moving. Got up to the summit, which is 12,500 feet, about daybreak, and it was completely socked in, cloud covered and foggy and raining, and the view was nothing. But that's just the way it went. But that was one experience I'll never forget. So then, as I said, I sailed back to the United States and was discharged at Camp Beale in California. Made my way back to Waynesburg. All I had here was my sister, my father having passed away in 1945, shortly after I had enlisted, actually. So anyway, I might add at this point that my father had become seriously ill when I was in high school, and I was able to finish high school by staying with friends of the family. And when I came back to this country then, his name was Brian, their names were Brian and Louise Jacobs, and Brian owned a cream station where he collected cream from the farmers and sent it to Pittsburgh to be made into butter. So he hired me. It just happened that he needed a cream tester just about the time I got back, so I went to work for him. And later that year, and that would have been 1947, I read in a paper where the post office was giving civil service tests. I took the test and was one of the top 3, was hired. So I started at the Waynesburg Post Office in January 1948 as a mail carrier. I worked there for 35 years. I carried mail in town until the last 9 years, and I became a rural mail carrier, delivering mail out in the country on RD1. It was about an 80-mile-a-day route, but I liked that better. I enjoyed that phase of my career the best. I retired in 1982 at the age of 55, and the next year our state representative, Bill DeWeese, he had one person working in the district office here, and she had quit, so he asked me if I would more or less fill in for this person, and turned out I worked for him for 23 years, always on a part-time basis. I quit that job in December of 2006, and haven't had any steady employment since then.
Taking us back, that covers your work history. While you, in all those different jobs, was there anything in particular that you remember that you took from that you'd like to share in all those years of working?
Well, I did leave out that when I was still in school, I had various paper routes, deliver newspapers. And then my senior year in high school, I worked at Murphy's 5 and 10 after school on Saturdays as a stock boy and general maintenance person. Of course, I quit that when I graduated from high school. Being in the military impressed me most of all. It seemed like my period of life growing up, I had a lot of hardships with the death of my mother and then my father becoming ill. But when I got in the military, it seemed like it raised my self-confidence, and everybody in there was pretty much equal. It didn't matter whether they were wealthy or poor, or we all had the same opportunities, and you could just do the best you could, and I think I benefited greatly from being in the military. Like I say, it gave me a sense of self-worth, and I felt that I did okay in there, and I think I learned a lot and benefited a lot from being in the military.
This covers a lot about your work experience. Well, how about the family life, your marriage? Can you tell us a little bit about how that evolved?
Well, when I returned from Japan back to Waynesburg, my sister worked with a lady named Frida Murray. And Frida Murray had a sister named Doris, and they introduced us. In April 1948 we met. I guess must have been love at first sight, because we got married in September that same year. We got married at the Jefferson Baptist Church in Jefferson, PA, by the Reverend Rich. Pretty much just a family affair. I didn't have much family, but she did. She was one of 7 children, and we went on a honeymoon to Niagara Falls and some other places, and came back and settled in Waynesburg. 1951, our oldest daughter was born, Deborah. In 1953, our son Doug was born. And in 1955, our youngest daughter, Susan, was born. And we've lived in Waynesburg ever since.
What were some of the things you remember about bringing up those 3 characters that you might want to share? Any stories of how things went in the elementary days or the high school days? Pretty cooperative group of kids?
Well, in elementary school, it was pretty much just a normal thing. One thing that impressed me was the discipline, the lack of disciplinary problems in school. Back in those days, if you weren't actually afraid of your teacher, you certainly respected them. And there were very few problems with discipline. Some of the stories I hear now are actually scary. In fact, my son-in-law was a high school teacher, and some of the experiences he had, it's just quite different from it was back in those days. Why, I don't know, but just the way it is, and the way it was. High school was a little more of a problem. I mean, I did well in school. I was always a good student, but the fact my father became ill, he had remarried, by the way, in 1938, married a lady who was a very, very good woman, very good to me, and I appreciated having her there. But he became ill and had to be sent away to a sanitarium, and sometime after that she did too, although she recovered.
And what was his illness?
Tuberculosis.
Could that have been connected to his World War I service?
I don't know. He never went overseas, so he was never subjected to gas. Mm-hmm. I think that affected a lot of him, but he served all his time in this country, and so I don't know. This something he got, but anyway, my high school years were kind of disrupted, but as I said before, I was able to finish by staying with Brian and Louise Jacobs, and I'll forever appreciate that. In fact, I wonder if I probably never made my feelings known to them. You know, I was young, and now when I think about it, what a great thing they did for me. And then not only me, Louise Jacobs' brother his mother had died when he was about 6, and he made his home with them also. His name was Howard Whittup, and we remained friends all the rest of his life. He died at age 70 in 1999, and in fact he eventually married my niece, so I became his uncle.
When you look back on all these different experiences, and you look at your travels and you look at the opportunities you've had, the triumphs, the tragedies, what are some things that you might want to share about some of your happier times, or some of the times that you look back on now and you say, well, that's that's what helped me get through this?
Well, my early childhood, just as I said, pretty much normal, happy as far as I was concerned. Things were different back then. It seemed like the people in the neighborhood were closer. They all had, we visited each other, and we'd sit on the porch, and now it seems like so many people don't even know their neighbors hardly. They live in a world of their own, but it was different back then. So growing up in my early years, was a pretty happy, normal time. In fact, my best friend, who lived on a neighboring property, he was 1 year younger than me. His name is Leroy Roberts, and we still to this day keep in touch, and have maintained our friendship all those years. My later years in school, as I said before, were kind of disrupted, but all you can do is keep going. You just have to, as they say, go with the flow.
Yeah.
They eventually seem like things work out, and after I after I enlisted in the military, things seemed to really straighten out for me.
Well, I know you were involved with a lot of different organizations. You were highly involved with the Elks and Masons. What were some of the things that these organizations helped you with?
Well, one of the first experience, my father was a Mason, and when I was in State College at Penn State, before I enlisted, a man called me and offered me a job in his photographic shop. And the reason he knew about me, my father had written him a letter, written, not him, but to the Masonic Lodge, and they evidently made some announcement, and he, as I say, he called me and offered me a job, which I needed, and I always appreciated that. So in later years, I became a Mason myself, and I was also a longtime member of the Elks Lodge, and now belong to the American Legion. Those organizations they're different in some ways, but they all they give you a sense of, let's say, brotherhood, maybe an association with people of like interests, and I think they're beneficial in a lot of ways.
Has that been your experience with your church experience? Work with the church?
I grew up grew up in the Methodist church. After I got married, my wife was belonged to the Baptist church, and I changed over. I don't really see that much difference in the various religions, like in the if you're a Protestant, I don't see that much difference in the various churches. So anyway, we now go to the little country church that she grew up in, and I'm the treasurer of that church, and I like it very much because it's a small, we maybe have 40 there on Sunday. Everybody knows everybody, and it's just more like a big family than it is a congregation. And I enjoy going to church. It's like a peaceful place to be, and we like our minister very well, and I enjoy it. I might mention 1947, when I came back from the service, I'd always had an interest in aviation, so I took advantage of the GI Bill and learned to fly at the Greene County Airport. I got my private license in 1947, and then in 1950 I obtained a commercial license. And one of my early ambitions would be to have been an airline pilot, but as it turned out, my vision had deteriorated somewhat, and I would never have been able to pass the physical. So, but I thoroughly enjoyed the flying. I had a couple hundred hours. One interesting thing that happened while I was flying, to get a commercial license at that time, you had to take a 300-mile each way cross-country flight. So I elected to go to an airport near Indianapolis, Indiana, and a friend of mine went with me. We went in February and went out there on a nice, beautiful, sunshiny day. And after we got there that day, a storm moved in, and we didn't get back home till about Thursday. That was quite an experience, because we didn't have much money, and I think we stayed in the YMCA. And but finally, later that week, we managed to make it back home, and without any tragedy.
When you think about, you mentioned the younger generation and different things that have influenced you in your life, if you were going to give some advice to your great-grandchildren about little things that you've learned or things that you live by, what might you say to them to help them get through their lives?
Well, I think one thing, they need to be serious about their education. It seems like it's especially true in this day and age that you just can't really advance very far in life without an education. So while you have the opportunity, you need to make the most of it. I guess that'd be the main piece of advice I would give them.
Well, as we bring this portion of our chapter to a close, is there anything else that you would like to add on any of the things that have been going through your mind? You mentioned how grateful you were to Brian and Louise Jacobs and how much that helped you and how much you appreciated it. Is there anything that you would like to say to conclude this chapter?
Well, referring to that particular phase of my life, you should make, if somebody like Brian and Louise does something very beneficial to you, and you should make your feelings known, how much you appreciate it. Tell them. Don't wait until they're gone and then think about it, which is probably what I did. But make your feelings known to them.
Well, thank you so much, Herb, for taking the time to do this, and we appreciate everything you had to say.